serious. People who have survived a murder attempt by dumb luck. What's your story? Story 1. I was around 20, 21 years old and walking home at about 3 a.m. after a night out. I was absolutely plastered from drinking so much, but I was only about 200 meters from my house when a hooded figure jumped out from behind a bush and immediately had a knife pushing into my stomach as he grabbed my neck and tried to pull me in. Fortunately, I was stronger and pulled away. He lunged at me with a knife when suddenly he stopped, stared for what felt like an eternity, was probably a second or two, and then said, "Holy crap, I haven't seen you in so long. My bad, mate," and then walked off as if nothing had happened. I still don't know who he was to this day. Story 2. Thank God for my nosy neighbors. I always used to hate how nosy they were, until this happened. When I was about 10, I was riding my bike outside. My parents always let me ride my bike outside during the summer, but only up and down the street we were on. One day, a man in a van was parked across the street. He called me, asking if I had seen his dog and could help him find it. Me, being a dumb child, offered to help him find it, and I started walking towards his van. My neighbor, an older white lady, came bolting out of her house, hooting and yelling, telling the guy to back off. So the dude gets back in his car in a hurry and takes off, and it wasn't until many years later that I realized how bad that situation could have actually been. Story 3. When I was about 10, my grandfather was dying from complications of his heart issues and mental deterioration. I didn't know him very well, as the last time we had been in contact was when I was a baby. My father never liked him and didn't bother coming with me and my mother to visit him in the hospital. When we got there, he was resting peacefully, and my mother went forward and whispered some words to him. I imagine his current state of health. I hung back a little bit because the creepy old guy, whom I didn't recall seeing in my whole life, really freaked me out. Regardless of my anxiety, my mom said I should approach Grandpa and share some nice words with him. I understood by how sad my mother was that I shouldn't argue too much, so I approached his hospital bed to speak to him. He didn't seem conscious at all, so I just did what my mother did, leaning forward and whispering some nice things to him. Things took a turn when, mid-sentence, his eyes flared open and he stared at me, making me stop what I'm saying. My heart dropped into my ass when he looked at me because it was pure hatred in his eyes. As soon as we made eye contact, he bolted upright from his bed and wrapped his hands around my neck and started throttling me as hard as he could. I barely even remember what happened, but my mom was screaming for a nurse. Grandpa kept yelling at me, and then he died. Almost as fast as it began, it was over. His grip loosened and he flatlined. My mother was inconsolable, and I was extremely confused and crying out of sheer trauma at the situation. Later, after we managed to calm down, a nurse explained to my mother that his severe dementia had left him barely coherent, and it was likely he had thought I was someone else. I didn't learn this until several years later, but my mother suspected my grandfather saw my father. Story 4. My dad has a client who owns a number of fast food restaurants. So one day, we were working at one of his stores, remodeling and talking about robberies. The client told us that when he was just getting into the fast food business, he lived in Colorado. He was an assistant manager at a chain that required him to wear a tie. So an addict came into the restaurant to rob them and grabbed him from behind. He opened the register and the guy attempted to slit his throat anyway, except the knife was dull and he couldn't cut through the material of the tie. The client began to fight back and escaped with minor injuries. The addict went to prison and apparently he has a tie in a frame at home. Story 5. I was a bouncer at a club in LA for a brief period in the 90s. One night I stopped some guys who were clearly affiliated with a gang at the door after they had refused security checks. They threatened me for a few minutes before leaving, spewing all sorts of warnings. Later on, things started to wind down, and since it was a little slow and we were overstaffed, I started drinking. I got a bit drunk, not wasted, but sleepy buzzed, so I told my buddy that I was going to lay down in the back of his car for a while. A few minutes after lying down, I realized I had to pee. I got out and stumbled a few steps into a spot between a guard gate for a parking lot and a building for a little privacy. There were a dozen people milling around in front of the club. I was about 25 feet away from the club's entrance and just off an alleyway. So while I was relieving myself, a guy ran past me around the guard booth to my rear and unloaded a 9mm, recovered rounds from the backseat, trunk, roof, and bumper into the backseat of the car I had just crawled out of. Bam, 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 he unloaded into the car. He then turned, ran right back past me and down the alley into the night. I don't think he saw me at all. Nothing really came of it except my partner was convinced I was a marked man and refused to be near me for a year or so. And this was LA. I was about 25 years old, almost 50 now, so some specifics are long gone. But I remember this. My buddy was genuinely terrified by this. I don't think he knew anything about it. In fact, he seemed to interpret the event as a larger conspiracy to have me snuffed, not some random pissed off dude making a point and getting jumped in. And because he ditched the car and wouldn't take my calls, it got left at that. For those concerned about the car, it was like a 1980s rusted out sedan, maybe a $500 car. Details about the slugs and number of rounds fired were relayed to me later by third parties. My friend and I were known in the neighborhood, people were talking about it. Thank you for the well wishes, though. Honestly, this wasn't even the first time I was shot at. It's been a long, strange trip. Also, I try to argue later that it's just as likely the guy was shooting at someone else across the street and that the car just got in the way. But there were holes all through that thing. The back seat had around 4 or 5 holes, another 2 or 3 went into the back window and ended up in the backs of the front seats, and another 2 or 3 rounds went right into the trunk. I honestly don't know if he was a terrible shot or if he hit right what he was aiming for. Story 6. I'm a criminal defense attorney representing a man who had embezzled almost $500,000 from his business partner. He was facing several years in prison, had some of his assets seized by the government, and was being sued by multiple creditors for over $2 million, and was in the midst of an ugly divorce and couldn't see his kids. He had 3 lawyers, criminal, civil, and divorce. He was drinking heavily and using cocaine, and I used to get incoherent phone calls from him in the middle of the night that ranged from threats to crying. One day, he came into my office, but I was in court. My secretary said he was civil, and he went to his divorce lawyer's office and shot him. He was later stopped by the police and wounded in a shootout. He told the cops that he had come to my office to shoot me that day and had also planned to shoot his civil attorney. Story 7. During my undergraduate years, I was abducted at a gas station. The locks on my car were broken, and as soon as I got back in, a strange man forced me to drive him to an ATM. Paralyzed with fear, any sense of reason I had disappeared. He claimed he worked at Wendy's and promised to give me all the Wendy's I wanted if I was generous. On the way to the ATM, he showed me pictures of his daughters on his clearly stolen cell phone. Then a Whitney Houston song came on the radio and he started crying and screaming, "Why do all the good people have to die? Only bad things should happen to bad people." So I withdrew the cash and gave it to him, thinking it was over, but he made me drive him somewhere else. As we passed by train tracks, I thought this was where he would kill me. He asked me what I was studying in school, and I told him biochemistry. "I believe in jet propulsion and all that shit. We are not alone. Aliens are among us," he said. He then made me pull over at a gas station and told me to drive away, sweetheart. I called the cops, did a lineup, and found out that he had done this to a lot of other women, some of whom were less fortunate than I was. Story 8. Mine's not extreme by any chance, but a couple of years ago, my brother and I went to walk the dog at around 11 p.m. We left through the side gate, we live on a corner, and right as we exited, I saw this weird-looking dude at the corner of the footpath walking weirdly towards us. I got bad vibes and told my brother to get the dog and get back inside. This dude was walking kind of sideways and hiding something in his hand behind his back. As I was getting my brother through the gate, the dude said something like, "Oi mate, can I come in? I need a blanket, I'm freezing." I just ignored him and went inside and locked the door. We then got a call from the people who lived 2 doors up. The same dude knocked on their door and their 10-year-old son opened it to see the dude holding a hatchet. Anyway, I'm glad I went with my gut on that one. Story 9. My supposed best friend decided that my wife and I were too perfect. Therefore, it must all be an act and I was obviously abusing her. He was at our house after I made an awesome dinner and we were having fun drinking and singing karaoke. I went to the kitchen to put some glasses away, came back and leaned on the couch with him slightly behind me to the left of me. Then I heard a thunk and felt an amazing amount of pain on the top of my head. He had picked up the whiskey bottle on the table. I was very confused as to what the was happening. Then the blood started pouring. I didn't want to get blood everywhere, so I went to the kitchen. The dude was pacing back and forth, saying weird shit. I thought about my gun, which was close by, but I wasn't thinking quite straight. He left. I had a huge concussion and still suffer side effects from it. My number 2 goal in life is to live longer than that hat just so I can poop on his grave. Story 10. I, 18 female back then, now 25, was on my way home at night after meeting a friend. My home was just 10 minutes away from the train station. After a few minutes, I felt someone following me. No big deal, I thought, just someone else walking home too. But I started walking faster, and I realized the person behind me was catching up. Weird. In my head, I started to make up scenarios of how to defend myself if the person would attack me. Never would I think of this to actually happen. Well, until I felt something on the back of my head hitting me hard. I went furious. I turned around and attacked the guy. My mind was just full of anger towards this stranger who, what I thought, hit me. We were wrestling until I fell on the ground. He was sitting on top of me, strangling me. I tried to crawl my nails into his eyes as deep as I could, but I started to black out. Suddenly, there was this thought in my head, wake up or you will die. Well, adrenaline kicked in again and I opened my eyes and screamed at the top of my lungs, attacking him again. That helped. He stood up and began to run. I lay there for a few seconds, then I started to run home, still screaming. My mom was already at our door and opened for me because my screams woke her up, or her mother senses, who knows. She immediately called the cops and they could arrest him on the same night. It turned out that he actually shot me in my head from behind. They assumed that the gun didn't work properly, the bullet didn't penetrate my skull and got stuck in there, but as far as I know, they never found out why the gun misfired. I'm glad though. He told the cops that he already followed me a few times in the past, but never had the guts to do it. I know, it's a wild story. Story 11. I was exiting a bar once after last call and was with a friend who was a medic. We saw a girl lying in a snowbank near a telephone pole who had just been hit by a car. We ran over and tried to help her. Some others were already on the phone with 911, and I, not having any medical training, didn't have anything to contribute but didn't want to just leave. The whole situation was concerning. I turned around for a second and started to hear people screaming. I turned around and a minivan was heading for us, the few people around this woman. They already started to run, but I was too late. He hit me as I was trying to flee, put the car in reverse, ran over me again, and then went forward and ran over me a third time. Turns out the guy was and drunk and got into a fight with the woman's boyfriend, whom I bore a strong resemblance to. He thought I was him. Not to throw a pity party for myself, but 9 years later, I have a ton of medical issues and my life pretty much started on a downward spiral since then. But for sure, I guess I survived. An off-duty cop watched the whole thing go down and copied his license plate number. He was apprehended 20 minutes later and charged with attempted murder along with many other things. He pleaded out to just 3 years in jail. He had actually killed someone else a few years before drunk driving. How they thought that was appropriate is beyond me. Story 12. I was 14 and outside in my garage petting my cat. It was November, so it was already dark by 5 p.m. Someone opened the door behind me without me hearing, grabbed me by my ponytail and started dragging me outside. They hit me on my head with a brick and knocked me out. They pulled me halfway around my house when, I'm guessing, they stabbed me. This must have brought me out of my daze because my mom said she heard me scream from inside where she and my brother and sister were in the kitchen. I had 12 stitches, double layer, a severe concussion, and whiplash. I didn't eat and hardly slept for a week. They never found the person who did it. Story 13. Well, my mom got mad at me when I was 20 and I didn't give her money for her birthday, which I'm assuming was to pay off her dealers, so she stabbed me and I had to get it taken out in surgery. Story 14. I was riding on a train across Eastern Europe. I was running low on money, and even though I had been warned that a woman should not be traveling alone in second-class seating, I did not spring for first class. I was sitting alone in one of the compartments that seats 6. This was also a mistake and a very stupid one to sit alone. Eventually, the train stopped and a man got on. He was very drunk. He came into my compartment and I guess he thought I looked like his ex-wife. He attacked me. If it were not for the fact that this particular station was the border between 2 countries, I would be dead. Instead, border patrol from both countries were on the train, and while I was unable to scream, the door was open and at least half a dozen uniformed men jumped on him and saved me. I was in the hospital for a little while but recovered. At one point during the trial, one of the cops asked me if I wanted him and his buddies to hold the guy down while I hit him. I thought he was joking, so I said no and told him to go ahead and do it himself. It turns out they took it seriously and were about to do it. I did put a stop to that at least, but they were so offended that someone from their country would attack a young female American tourist. They were furious with him. So many people there depended upon tourism. Story 15. This all happened many years ago. I was a lead man at a factory when a girl started working there, and I took an interest in her. After a few months, I found out she was in a terrible relationship. Every night, I told her to call me and I'd come get her. Finally, after months, she called me and I came to get her and took her to my house. The guy she was in the relationship with didn't take too kindly to me taking her away. He spent the next 2 years harassing and threatening us. A few months after she and I got married, we went out for a few drinks. Her ex just happened to be at the bar we went to. He apologized to us for the threats and harassment. We were sitting outside talking with a few other people. Next thing I knew, I was on my back on the ground with someone choking me. I tried all I could to get them off of me, but being blindsided and them being on top of me, it wasn't easy. As I struggled to get free, everything went black and then I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. At that moment, I was certain that this was the end of me. I somehow managed to get a better hold of this person's head and yank them off of me. We ran to the car and got away. A week or so later, my wife had been talking to everyone she thought might know what happened. It turns out her ex had paid two people $50 to kill me that night. Story 16. I was doing volunteer work in Central America, working in a really bad area of the capital city. It was a slum built on top of the city's garage dump. The whole place reeked of trash, and there were large metal cylinders coming up out of the ground throughout the area to vent the gas from decomposing garbage underground. As a fellow volunteer and I walked down a dirt path, two men approached us. I'd never seen them before. They were acting strangely, but I just thought they were drunk or a lot of people in the area drank rubbing alcohol to get drunk since it was cheaper than beer or liquor. Over time, drinking the rubbing alcohol would really mess with their brains. As the men got closer, they began acting really friendly, too friendly. One of them came close to me, trying to put his arm around my shoulders. At first, it seemed like the behavior of a guy who gets happy and friendly when he's drunk. However, an alarm went off in my head and I gently but firmly pushed him away. I tried to make it seem lighthearted and playful, like, "Hey man, how's it going?" Affectionate shove. I didn't want to make a scene since I was a gringo. I didn't want to seem like an ugly American. This went on over and over down the whole path. He'd get close, I'd shove him off, he'd come close again. Finally, my friend and I came to a fork in the path and we went one way while they went another. After we got to the house of some people we knew, we told them about the two guys. I was so focused on protecting myself, I didn't even notice much of what was happening with the other guy. They said, "Oh, everyone around here knows him. That's his routine. He comes up to people, pretends to be friendly, puts his arm around them, then pulls out his knife and stabs them in the stomach." I was that close to getting stabbed to death.